The moment my body went under that SUV, time collapsed. My spine shattered like glass, but strangely, I felt myself splitting in two. One part screaming under metal, another calmly watching from above. I was dying, yet more aware than ever before. What happened next demolished everything I believed as a scientist. There's a reason we fear death. Not because it's the end, but because it reveals the lie we've been living. I died an atheist. I returned, something else entirely. And I can never go back to who I was. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. It was a big shift for me as a scientist to suddenly have my entire world flipped upside down. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unexperience what I had experienced. The interviewer sitting across from me had that familiar look in their eyes, skepticism mixed with curiosity. I'd seen it hundreds of times since I began sharing my story. Before my near-death experience, I was a scientist and technical writer. My entire career had been built on empirical evidence, measurable data, and logical conclusions. The spiritual realm wasn't just something I disbelieved in, it was something I actively dismissed as fantasy. Science was my religion, evidence my scripture. So Nancy, I've heard you had a near-death experience. Could you tell us about it? The interviewer asked, leaning forward with anticipation. I smiled, recognizing the irony of my position. How did a confirmed atheist become a spokesperson for the afterlife? The universe has quite a sense of humor. At the time this happened, I was living near Boulder, Colorado, I began. I was firmly rooted in the physical world. The scientific method guided every aspect of my life. I wrote technical papers, analyzed data, and based all my conclusions on observable evidence. The idea of anything beyond this physical existence seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. I paused, remembering the woman I used to be, so certain, so confined by what I thought was an expansive worldview, but was actually a cage. The woman who believed that when the brain stopped, consciousness simply ended. No continuation, no transition, just darkness. I never expected to change my mind about this. Why would I? My perspective was backed by science, by rationality. But then again, I said with a gentle laugh, I never expected to die and come back either. The interviewer nodded encouragingly. The thing is, I continued, when something like this happens, when you experience what I experienced, it's not a matter of belief anymore. It's knowledge. And that knowledge transformed me completely. I know what a hallucination feels like. I know what dreams feel like. This wasn't that. I took a deep breath, ready to share the experience that had fundamentally altered my understanding of reality and consciousness. The journey that showed me our existence extends far beyond what we can measure with our instruments or comprehend with our limited human perspective. On what seemed like an ordinary day, I was riding my bicycle through Boulder, doing errands around town. The sky was clear, the air crisp with that distinctive Colorado freshness. I was in the bike lane, following all the rules, when life as I knew it shattered in an instant. A woman driving a large SUV was texting behind the wheel. She wasn't paying attention to the road, to the traffic signal, or to me, a vulnerable cyclist crossing the intersection with the right-of-way. She blew through the intersection at full speed, and the impact when she hit me broadside was catastrophic. The moment of collision exists in my memory with unnatural clarity. I heard the screech of tires too late to react, felt the horrifying impact of metal against flesh and bone, experienced the sickening sensation of being thrown from my bike and then pulled beneath the vehicle. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Milliseconds expanded into what felt like minutes, each moment etched with excruciating detail. This is when the first extraordinary thing happened. I experienced being in two places at once. One part of me remained trapped under the SUV, my body being dragged across the asphalt. This physical part of me felt every excruciating sensation, the grinding of broken bones, the tearing of flesh, the desperate struggle for breath, as my lungs were compressed. This part of me was consumed by primitive terror and the primal will to survive, every cell screaming in unified protest against what was happening. But simultaneously, another part of my consciousness, what I would later come to understand as my soul or higher self, was standing at a distance, observing the entire accident with astonishing detachment and clarity. From this vantage point, I could see my broken body under the vehicle. I could see the driver's face transition from distraction to horror as she realized what had happened. I could see bystanders rushing toward the scene, some pulling out phones to call for help, others frozen in shock. This observing part of me felt no pain, no fear, only a profound sense of calm and the absolute certainty that regardless of what happened to my physical form, I would be okay. It was almost as if this part of me was gently reassuring the suffering physical me. Don't worry, this isn't the end. No matter what happens next, everything is unfolding as it should. The duality of this experience was so pronounced, so real. Not like a dream or hallucination, but like experiencing two valid realities simultaneously. I wouldn't understand the full significance of this split perception until much later, but even in that moment, some deep part of me recognized that something profound and unexplainable was occurring. When the paramedics arrived, which seemed both instantaneous and an eternity, these two aspects of my consciousness merged back into my broken body. I tried to speak, to tell them what had happened, but couldn't form words through the pain. The emergency team worked quickly and efficiently, stabilizing my neck, carefully extracting me from beneath the vehicle, and transferring me to a backboard. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I heard one paramedic say to another, "Multiple spinal fractures, possible internal bleeding. We need to move fast." Then to me, "Hang in there. We've got you." I remember looking up at the blue Colorado sky one last time before the ambulance doors closed, thinking with strange clarity, whatever happens next, I am not the same person I was 5 minutes ago. I had no idea how prophetic that thought would prove to be. In those first moments after the accident, I was still primarily concerned with physical survival. The full metaphysical implications of what I had just experienced, being in two places at once, wouldn't register until later. At that point, I was simply grateful to be alive, unaware that this accident was only the beginning of a journey that would dismantle and reconstruct everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the nature of consciousness itself. The full extent of my injuries became apparent in the emergency room through a barrage of imaging tests. My spine was essentially shattered. 9 vertebrae cracked or completely fractured, one of them almost entirely destroyed. The medical team stopped counting individual fractures after they reached 100. Most of the damage was concentrated in my neck and along my spinal column. My helmet had saved my life. Without it, the doctors later told me, I would have died at the scene. The first few days in the hospital blur together in my memory, a haze of pain, medication, and the constant beeping of monitors. I drifted in and out of consciousness, aware enough to understand the gravity of my situation, but too overwhelmed to fully process it. The specialists who paraded through my room spoke in hushed, serious tones about surgical options, recovery timelines, and the possibility, mentioned with careful euphemisms, that I might never walk again. "We need to surgically stabilize your spine," the neurosurgeon explained on Sunday morning, his face grave. "Several vertebrae need to be fused, and we need to remove bone fragments that are dangerously close to your spinal cord." The accident had happened on Friday, and I had spent the weekend in intensive care while the medical team worked to stabilize me enough for surgery. The operation was scheduled for Monday afternoon. As they explained the procedure, the risks, the potential complications, the extended recovery time, I listened with a strange detachment. Part of me understood the severity of what was happening, but another part was still trying to make sense of that moment during the accident when I had experienced being in two places simultaneously. From a scientific perspective, I had always dismissed out-of-body experiences as hallucinations, the brain's response to trauma or oxygen deprivation. But what I had experienced felt fundamentally different from a hallucination. It had a clarity, a coherence, a sense of heightened rather than diminished awareness. This contradiction nagged at me even through the fog of pain medication. When Monday afternoon arrived, I was wheeled into the operating room, the bright lights overhead seeming unnaturally harsh. I remember the anesthesiologist's kind eyes above his surgical mask as he prepared to administer the medication that would put me under. "We'll take good care of you," he promised, patting my hand. As the anesthetic began flowing into my veins, I felt a momentary panic. Not about the surgery itself, but about losing consciousness. Some part of me was afraid of what might happen when I let go of control. "Count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist instructed. I began counting. 10, 9, 8. I never reached 7. As the anesthetic took hold, something unexpected happened. Instead of the gradual fade to unconsciousness I expected, I experienced what medical records would later clinically describe as cardiac arrest during induction of anesthesia. In simpler terms, I coded. My heart stopped beating, my blood pressure plummeted to 0, and my breathing ceased. But, from my perspective, I hadn't lost consciousness at all. In fact, I had never been more awake. The transition was instantaneous. One moment, I was on the operating table counting backward, and the next I found myself standing upright on a hillside of indescribable beauty. The confusion I felt was momentary but intense. I remembered with perfect clarity that I had been about to undergo surgery, that I was severely injured. Yet here I was, standing without pain, looking out over mountains and forests bathed in the most extraordinary light. Wait a minute, I thought, this is not where I'm supposed to be right now. The landscape around me was simultaneously familiar and utterly unlike anything I'd seen on Earth. Everything seemed more vibrant, more alive, more real than reality itself. Colors possessed depths and dimensions I'd never experienced before, not just brighter or more saturated, but somehow more essential, as if I was seeing the true nature of color for the first time. The air, if it was air, felt thick with life and meaning. What struck me immediately was the quality of awareness I was experiencing. My mind wasn't dulled by anesthesia, quite the opposite. I felt more alert, more present, more conscious than I had ever felt in my physical body. My thoughts were crystal clear, my perceptions heightened to an astonishing degree. I could sense every blade of grass, feel the energy in the mountains before me, perceive the intricate connections between everything in this landscape. As I stood there trying to orient myself, I began to notice something remarkable flowing into me. It wasn't a physical sensation like heat or sound. It was more fundamental, more primal. It was an energy that I somehow immediately recognized as divine love. This recognition puzzled the scientific part of my mind. How could I recognize something I had never believed in? Yet the experience was unmistakable. A peaceful, calming, loving, accepting presence surrounding and permeating me. It was at this moment that I experienced an internal double take, a cognitive dissonance so profound it nearly overwhelmed me. The religious upbringing of my childhood had taught me that, as a non-believer, I had no chance of going to any happy afterlife. That wasn't in the cards for someone like me. And yet, what I was feeling was unequivocal acceptance, love, and a welcoming presence that knew me completely, knew all my flaws, all my doubts, all my rejections of spirituality, and embraced me anyway. The analytical scientist in me was still trying to make sense of the situation. I wonder if I died on the operating table, I thought with surprising detachment. It seemed like a strong possibility. And then following that thought, but wait, if I did die, why am I here, experiencing this love and acceptance? This contradicts everything I was taught about the afterlife. I didn't voice this question aloud, it was purely an internal wondering. But to my astonishment, an answer came. The response didn't originate from within my own thoughts. It came from outside, from everywhere around me. It wasn't distinctly male or female, but it was unmistakably powerful, clear, and directed specifically to me. This is your home. You are a part of me, like a child. You are part of this realm. This is your home. Welcome home. The impact of these words was overwhelming. In that instant, understanding flooded through me. Not intellectual understanding, but a deep, soul-level recognition of truth. I suddenly remembered that Earth, that physical existence, was just a temporary state. This place, this level of consciousness, was my true home. I wept, not with physical tears, but with the emotional essence of weeping, at the profound relief and joy of remembering what my human life had caused me to forget. As I absorbed this revelation, I sensed a presence approaching, what felt distinctly like a female energy. She was difficult to see clearly, her features somewhat indistinct, but her embrace when she reached me was real and comforting. This presence told me she would be my teacher, guiding me through what I needed to know before returning to my life on Earth. Her words shocked me. Return? To Earth? To that broken body on the operating table? My reaction was instantaneous and vehement. I did not want to go back. The peace, the love, the sense of belonging I felt in this place was so complete, so perfect, that the thought of leaving it behind was unbearable. I protested with the spiritual equivalent of a tantrum. "You've already agreed to go back," she explained gently. "That was part of your plan when you chose this life as Nancy." I objected that I had no memory of such an agreement, and in response, she showed me what can only be described as a kind of ethereal video, a living memory of myself, before my human birth, making choices about the life I would lead. In this vision, I saw that I had chosen to experience being an atheist for a time, to turn away from spiritual awareness, but with the intention of eventually returning to it. I had arranged several potential turning points in my earlier life where I could have reconnected with spirituality, but had missed them all. This accident, this near-death experience, was the final opportunity, the wake-up call I had built into my own life plan. Seeing this, I reluctantly acknowledged the agreement, though I remained deeply resistant to leaving the peace of this realm. My teacher, understanding my reluctance, began to guide me through a series of lessons that would help me return to Earth with new purpose and understanding. One of the most profound lessons took place in what appeared to be a vast open prairie. Around me materialized what looked like an enormous map, not of Earth's geography, but of my life's journey. This map showed, in real time, all the different paths I could have taken, the decision points, the alternate routes my life might have followed with different choices. "There is no single right path," my teacher explained as I studied this incredible visualization. "Life offers infinite possibilities for growth and learning. Every choice creates new opportunities, new challenges, new ways to experience love and compassion." I saw countless versions of my life branching out like a cosmic tree, each with its own beauty, its own purpose, its own lessons. This revelation was profoundly liberating, the understanding that we are not bound to one predetermined correct path, but are constantly co-creating our journey through our choices. But the most transformative lesson came when my teacher brought me to a beautiful pond nestled in the mountains. By this point, I was growing weary of lessons, eager to either stay in this realm permanently, or, if I must, return to Earth. My teacher, sensing my impatience, placed her hands on her hips and said with gentle firmness, "Would you just do it, please?" Reluctantly, I reached out and touched the surface of the pond. The water rippled outward from my touch, and on each ripple appeared scenes from my life. Not just images, but living moments that I could experience again in their fullness. As I focused on one ripple, a moment from my teenage years when I had deliberately said something cruel to my younger sister, I was suddenly pulled into that memory. But this time, I didn't just relive the moment from my perspective. I felt what my sister felt. I experienced the hurt, the betrayal, the confusion my words had caused her. Though she hadn't outwardly reacted much at the time, internally she had been devastated. And now I felt every nuance of that devastation as if it were my own pain. The experience was horrifying, gut-wrenching, to feel firsthand the suffering I had carelessly inflicted on someone I loved. It showed me with unmistakable clarity that we don't live on this planet in isolation. Everything we do and say affects others in ways we can rarely fully comprehend in the moment. But my teacher didn't leave me in that state of remorse. She directed my attention to another ripple, a time when I had complimented a grocery store clerk during the chaotic holiday season, telling her she was doing an amazing job despite dealing with rude customers. I felt the clerk's gratitude, the way my simple words had lifted a weight from her shoulders and restored her faith in humanity. I felt how that small interaction had changed her entire day, how she had gone home with a lighter heart and been more present, more loving with her children because of it. Through this life review, I experienced countless moments, some painful, some beautiful, all from both my perspective and the perspective of those I had interacted with. The lesson was clear and transformative. Everything we do matters, every interaction leaves an imprint. And the currency of existence is love in its many forms: kindness, compassion, understanding, forgiveness. Before sending me back, my teacher provided one final gift. Knowing the physical pain that awaited me upon my return to my broken body, she performed what I can only describe as an energy healing. focusing on the areas that would be most painful. Her hands didn't physically touch me, but I felt waves of healing energy penetrating what would soon again be my physical form, preparing it to receive my consciousness with less suffering. And then, with gentle firmness, she told me it was time to return. Despite all I had learned, I still resisted. The contrast between the peace of this realm and the pain that awaited me on earth was too stark. But I understood now that I had a purpose to fulfill, lessons to learn and to share, people to help on their own journeys. With profound reluctance but newfound determination, I surrendered to the transition back to physical existence. I awoke in the recovery room, not with the gradual emergence from anesthesia that most patients experience, but with a violent jolt into consciousness. The medical staff would later describe it as one of the most dramatic wake-ups they'd ever witnessed. I came to literally kicking and screaming at the top of my lungs. "Go back! Send me back!" The recovery nurse jumped in alarm, calling urgently for the doctor. From her perspective, something was going terribly wrong medically. From my perspective, I had just been ripped away from paradise and thrust back into a body filled with excruciating pain. As I gradually became aware of my surroundings, the beeping monitors, the sterile smell, the concerned faces hovering over me, I continued babbling about wanting to return, asking repeatedly for my teacher. The medical staff, completely baffled, thought I was referring to a friend waiting in the visitors area. When they brought this person in, I became even more agitated. No, not her, the one who was with me when I was dead. The looks exchanged among the hospital staff conveyed their concern about my mental state. I could almost see them making notes about possible brain damage or adverse reactions to anesthesia. But I knew with absolute certainty what had happened, and their skepticism couldn't touch the core of truth I now carried. For the next 12 hours, I didn't sleep. Despite the physical exhaustion and pain, my mind was too active, too full of everything I had experienced. I was afraid to tell anyone the full story, certain they would dismiss it as hallucination, or worse, have me evaluated for psychiatric issues. Yet I couldn't simply dismiss what had happened either. It was too real, too consistent, too meaningful. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A chaplain from the hospital came to visit me. When I had first been admitted, I had actually refused chaplain services, explicitly telling the staff, "I'm an atheist, I don't want to see a chaplain." They had respected my wishes until now. When the chaplain walked in, instead of asking her to leave, I found myself saying, "Oh, thank God you're here." The words came out before I could stop them, and their irony wasn't lost on me. An avowed atheist thanking God. But in that moment, I desperately needed someone who might be open to what I had experienced. For nearly an hour, I poured out my story to her, describing the hillside, the divine love, my teacher, the life review, everything I could recall in my still fragile state. I made a point of telling her I was refusing most pain medication, taking only Tylenol despite the severe pain because I wanted to ensure my mind was clear. "I know what hallucinations are like," I insisted. This wasn't one of them. The chaplain listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly engaged. When I finished, she took my hand and said something that would prove instrumental in my ability to process this experience. "What you had was what's called a near-death experience, and I want you to understand that it was real." Her validation was like a lifeline. In that moment, I realized how fortunate I was to have someone immediately confirm the validity of my experience. Many who go through NDEs are dismissed, their profound spiritual encounters reduced to oxygen deprivation or misfiring neurons. Had the chaplain not been there to validate what happened, I might have eventually convinced myself it was indeed just a hallucination, a trick of my traumatized brain. Instead, she gave me permission to trust my own experience, to begin the process of integrating it into my understanding of reality. And that process would require nothing less than completely dismantling and rebuilding my entire worldview. My near-death experience wasn't isolated. Looking back, I realized there had been moments throughout my life when the veil between physical and spiritual reality had thinned, though I had always found ways to dismiss or rationalize these experiences. Now, with my scientific framework shattered, I began to recognize patterns and connections I had previously ignored. About a year before my accident, I had an extraordinary experience connected to my father, who was battling terminal cancer at the time. He was determined to go hunting one last time, despite being so frail he could barely walk. Concerned for his safety, but wanting to honor his wishes, I volunteered to accompany him. The evening before our hunting trip, I was staying at my parents' house and feeling unusually agitated. Though I practiced meditation regularly, I did so purely for stress reduction, not for any spiritual purpose. That night, I retreated to the guest bedroom to meditate, hoping to calm my anxiety. What happened next defied all my scientific understanding. As I settled into meditation, I suddenly wasn't myself anymore. I was experiencing life through someone else's eyes. A young man named Sydney. Through Sydney's perspective, I found myself standing with a group of young men in what appeared to be the late 1940s or early 1950s. One of these young men was my father, much younger than I had ever seen him in photographs. The most striking detail was that Sydney kept calling my father Willie. This caught my attention immediately, because nobody in our family ever called my father that. He was known as Bill or William, never Willie. I had never heard of anyone named Sydney in my father's life, yet here I was, experiencing this young man's memories with extraordinary clarity. Through Sydney's eyes, I witnessed his close friendship with my young father. Then the scene changed, and I understood that Sydney had volunteered for military service. The vision shifted again, and I was with Sydney in what appeared to be a fierce battle. The trees were burning, gunfire erupted from all directions, and Sydney was trying to lead his squad to safety. In this chaotic scene, I witnessed Sydney's death. As suddenly as this vision had begun, it ended. But before I returned fully to my own consciousness, I distinctly heard Sydney's voice. "Tell Willie I'm sorry I didn't come back." The experience left me shaken. My scientific mind immediately tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I had overheard stories about my father's friend at some point and forgotten them, or maybe this was just an unusually vivid daydream. But something about it felt too real, too specific to dismiss entirely. The next morning, as my father and I were loading gear into his truck for our hunting trip, I gathered my courage. Taking him aside where my mother couldn't hear, I asked quietly, "Dad, who's Sydney?" My father's reaction was immediate and profound. He physically stepped back, his eyes widening in shock. "How do you know about Sydney?" he demanded, his voice unsteady. I hesitated, then decided to simply tell the truth. "He came to me last night. He told me he was sorry he couldn't come back from Korea." At this, my father did something I had never seen before. He began to cry. This stoic man who rarely showed emotions stood before me with tears streaming down his face. When he finally composed himself, he confirmed that Sydney had indeed been his best friend when they were young men. Sydney, slightly older than my father, had enlisted to fight in the Korean War and never returned. In that moment, standing in the driveway with hunting gear half loaded, something shifted between my father and me. He never spoke about Sydney again, and I didn't press him. But I believe that message provided him some measure of peace as he faced his own mortality. For me, it was a crack in my materialist worldview. One I promptly sealed over with rationalizations and explanations, but which had weakened the foundation nonetheless. My father passed away about a year later. The moment of his death created another inexplicable spiritual experience. I was asleep at home when I suddenly awoke at 4 a.m. with the clear vision of my father standing at the foot of my bed. No words were spoken, but I knew with certainty that he had just passed and had come to say goodbye. Moments later, the phone rang. It was my brother calling to tell me our father had died. Driving to my parents' house with my partner, I experienced something even more extraordinary. As I reached for the front door handle, I was suddenly enveloped by the most beautiful music I had ever heard. An ethereal, transcendent chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It wasn't human music. It had qualities and dimensions beyond what any earthly choir or orchestra could produce. "Do you hear that?" I asked my partner, who looked at me in confusion. "Hear what?" The music was accompanied by an overwhelming sense of joy, my father's joy, and a feeling of welcome. For a brief, precious moment, I had another glimpse into the spiritual realm I would later experience more fully during my NDE. But at the time, I shut it down hard, refusing to acknowledge its implications for my materialist worldview. When I shared these experiences with my physician about a year after my NDE, he surprised me by admitting that he regularly witnessed similar phenomena in his dying patients. "It happens at least once a month," he confided. "Most doctors don't talk about it because we don't know what to make of it, but I think it's one of the most fascinating aspects of medicine, this evidence that consciousness somehow continues." These experiences, my father's visitation, the transcendent music, Sydney's message, created a pattern that I had spent years denying. My near-death experience didn't introduce me to a completely foreign reality. It finally forced me to acknowledge what had been revealing itself to me in glimpses throughout my life. The woman who woke up in that recovery room was fundamentally different from the woman who had been wheeled into surgery. My scientific training hadn't vanished. I still value evidence, still approach problems methodically. But my understanding of what constitutes reality had expanded beyond measure. Everything I learned during my near-death experience ultimately circled back to one central truth: love. Not the limited, conditional love we often experience in our human relationships, but a vast, all-encompassing love that forms the very fabric of existence. I learned that compassion, kindness, and gratitude aren't just pleasant social constructs. They're fundamental energetic forces that strengthen the spiritual bonds connecting all living things. The energy of love is transformative, even when not expressed in words or actions. Our internal state, our thoughts, feelings, intentions, radiates outward, affecting situations and people in ways we may never consciously recognize. This understanding transformed how I move through the world, how I interact with others, and perhaps most challenging, how I treat myself. Many people ask me if I'm afraid of death after my experience. The truth is, I'm not afraid of dying anymore. What comes after physical death is more real, more alive than what we experience here. But I have developed a profound respect for the purpose of this physical life. We're here to learn, to grow, to experience the full spectrum of human emotion, and most importantly, to love ourselves, each other, and all of creation. The most powerful evidence of my experience isn't in the metaphysical details I can share, but in how fundamentally it changed me. I went from a confirmed atheist to someone with an unshakable knowledge of spiritual reality. Not belief, knowledge. My website, nancyryans.com, contains more information about my book, classes, workshops, and speaking engagements for those interested in learning more. But my most important message is simple. There is more to our existence than what we can see or measure. We are loved beyond comprehension. And death is not the end, it's merely a transition back to our true home. Have you ever wondered if this is really all there is? If the daily grind, the career milestones, the material possessions are the sum total of our existence? Nancy's journey shows us what many of us secretly suspect, but are afraid to embrace: that we are more than our physical bodies, more than our achievements, more than our failures. Think about the regrets that keep you awake at night, the harsh words you can't take back, the relationships that fractured, the chances you didn't take. Nancy's life review shows us that these moments matter, not because they define us, but because they affect others in ways we rarely comprehend. But here's the truth that might set you free. It's never too late to change course. Many of us reach midlife feeling trapped in the identities we've built: the skeptic, the achiever, the caretaker, the pragmatist. We've invested decades in certain beliefs about reality, about who we are. Abandoning these feels like admitting our lives have been built on sand. Nancy was a scientist who staked her entire worldview on empirical evidence. Then in an instant, everything changed. Not because she wanted it to, but because reality broke through her carefully constructed barriers. What walls have you built that might be keeping out the most profound truths of your existence? The most haunting aspect of Nancy's experience isn't what she saw on the other side. It's the realization that love is the only thing that ultimately matters. Not the love of romantic movies or greeting cards, but love as the fundamental energy that connects all beings, the kind that asks nothing in return. When was the last time you acted from this kind of love? When did you last truly see someone? The cashier, your aging parent, the colleague everyone avoids. When did someone last truly see you? You don't need to die to recognize what matters. You don't need to code on an operating table to understand that your smallest kindnesses ripple outward in ways you'll never witness. You don't need a catastrophic accident to give yourself permission to question what you've always believed. The clock is ticking, not to create fear, but to inspire action. Whether you have decades left or days, the question remains: will you live with your soul awake or asleep? Will you risk the magnificent discomfort of growth or cling to certainties that no longer serve you? The choice has always been yours. Perhaps today is the day you finally make it. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.